From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of the State of Israel.
It was the press conference everyone had been waiting for.
Thank you very much, everybody.
On Monday, the White House played host to a moment that could make history.
So this is a big day, a beautiful day, potentially one of the great days ever in civilization.
And Donald Trump, always prone to hyperbole, was going to make the most of it.
We discussed how to end the war in Gaza, but it's just a part of the bigger picture, which is peace in the Middle East. And let's call it eternal peace in the Middle East.
President Trump, with Netanyahu next to him, unveiled a 20-point plan backed by multiple countries which would end the war in Gaza. With his eye firmly on the Nobel Peace Prize, Trump made sure that everyone knew who was going to be in charge of making it happen.
My plan calls for the creation of a new international oversight body, the Board of Peace, we call it, the Board of Peace, sort of a beautiful name, the Board of Peace, which will be headed, not at my request, believe me, I'm very busy, but we have to make sure this works. Everybody involved asked me to do this, so it would be headed by a gentleman known as President Donald J. Trump of the United States.
But since then, cracks are already showing. One of Netanyahu's cabinet colleagues has declared the plan a resounding diplomatic failure which will end in tears, while on the other side, there are no signs from Hamas that they'll be signing up.
But if Hamas rejects your plan, Mr. President, or if they supposedly accept it and then basically do everything to counter it, then Israel will finish the job by itself.
So can the plan work? What would a post-war Gaza even look like? And how is Tony Blair involved? The story today. Trump declares an eternal peace deal, but do either side want it? Gabby, if you're happy, we can get stuck in. So just remind our listeners of who you are and where you are.
My name's Gabrielle Weiniger. I'm the Times correspondent based in Tel Aviv. I've been covering the war in Gaza since it was sparked on October the 7th.
You, like so many Middle East correspondents around the world, really, will have been watching the press conference on Monday night in the White House very closely. Just describe the scene for us.
We were waiting quite a long time for President Trump and Netanyahu. And I think there was just a real energy of anticipation about what was going to be announced. There's a lot of hope on both sides, I think, among the people of Gaza and among the people of Israel, that this war will be brought to an end. And President Trump spoke for a long time, a very hyperbolic speech. He used words like, "This is the greatest days ever in civilization." And he used a phrase that really stuck with me. He said, we might see eternal peace in the Middle East. And these are phrases that I think, just spark hope in people. But when you really get down to the nitty-gritty of what was said, yes, there is a comprehensive pathway and roadmap to peace on the table. It's been agreed by Israel. It's been presented by the US. There are very lofty ideals in this map to peace. Can this theory be turned into something practical on the ground? I'm not so sure. And I did spot some caveats in those speeches by Trump and Netanyahu, including, of course, that if Hamas doesn't agree to this deal within 72 hours, Israel has free reign to continue to pound Gaza City. So it could be one of the most decisive and defining days in Middle Eastern history in recent memory. It could also just be another attempt to make peace.
Gabby, talk us through the actual plan. This is 20 points. What are they?
The main one is that there will be a long-term truce. So this, as we said before, this isn't just a short-term ceasefire deal, but a plan and a roadmap towards peace. To get into the nitty-gritty details, within 72 hours of this agreement being signed or publicly accepted, is the wording that was used, the Israeli hostages, living and dead, so around 20 living hostages, will be released in exchange for more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails. For every Israeli hostage whose remains are released, so the deceased ones, Israel will also release the remains of 15 deceased Gazans. That's something we often see in ceasefires, this kind of exchange of bodies as well. One of the controversial points in this peace plan is this. This is what Hamas may decide to reject the plan on. Hamas members who commit to a peaceful coexistence and decommission their weapons will be given amnesty. They can either agree to stay in Gaza and live in coexistence, or they can be given safe passage out of Gaza. One would assume they will go to places like Qatar and Turkey, where some Hamas leaders are exiled already. Hamas have never agreed to disarm. They have never agreed to demilitarize. They have never agreed to decommission their weapons. I think that's a very interesting point that Hamas may double down on.
Gabby, you mentioned that moment where they said that if Hamas doesn't sign up within 72 hours, Israel would be allowed to do what it wanted to. It had free reign, effectively.
Yeah.
That was a very chilling moment. We also Netanyahu also said that even if they did sign up, at a later date, if he felt that they weren't holding on to the conditions, again, Israel could end the job, as he put it, in the way that they wanted to. I found that quite chilling too. I mean, it felt a little bit like the sort of things that Putin often says, where he's almost setting people up for the response that's coming.
Yeah, setting them up for failure. I think it was quite telling. Netanyahu gave a video address in Hebrew after the press conference, and he said, under no circumstances will there ever be a Palestinian state.
גם לא כתוב בהסכם. אבל דבר אחד כן אמרנו, שאנחנו נתנגד בתוקף למדינה הפלסטינית. הנשיא טראמפ גם...
There are things on the table as well, like the full disarmament of Hamas, that Hamas have never agreed to. So there are kind of these loopholes or exit ramps from this grand plan that can see this all go down the drain and this idea of peace not work. And Netanyahu is also appealing to his voter base, to his government, to his very hard-line right-wing coalition who don't want to see a deal, who want to see the continuation of the war in Gaza, who want to see Jewish civilization rebuilt in the Gaza Strip. And the civilians, the Gazan civilians, the indigenous people of the Gaza Strip, or those who have moved there since 1948, leave that territory. And that's still on the cards.
Gabby, it's so interesting that, you were able to watch Netanyahu's address in Hebrew to Israel, effectively. And even the press conference itself, it didn't seem to match the terms in the actual deal. There was a lot of talk of there being no Palestinian state, for example. That's not what the deal says.
There's kind of this loophole, right? So the deal actually says that there will be a international force chaired by President Trump, along with several other leaders, to rule some kind of transitional government in the Gaza Strip until the Palestinian Authority will take over. But that's all contingent on the Palestinian Authority undertaking internal reforms. Who's going to judge when the Palestinian Authority is sufficiently reformed? What the reforms are they? Will there be elections? What's going to happen in the West Bank to the Palestinian Authority over the next, let's say it really is 5 years?
Gabby, we should say that one of the difficulties for Hamas in this will be that while they're being told they have to put down their arms completely, there is a real question mark about the IDF's role in Gaza over the next few years.
That's exactly right. And I think that's also something Netanyahu said in Hebrew, that Israel will remain in security control of the Gaza Strip. How does that coincide with Israel withdrawing from Gaza? I think the idea that we were presented in the American plan is, we saw a map of this, is that there will be staged withdrawals of the Israeli troops gradually pulling back. But they may well decide, we need to stay in the Philadelphia corridor, which has been a sticking point before between Gaza and Egypt, or we need to stay in the Netzarim corridor, which separates north and south of the Gaza Strip. There are so many practical hurdles along the way of this vague wording, the way where Israel can just decide, actually, we need to do this for our own security.
And Gabby, it's so interesting because you've heard the Hebrew version of this deal, effectively how it's being pitched to the country, it does sound like Netanyahu is very much in a maximalist version of what the IDF should be doing in Gaza.
I think there are just exit ramps, and he is outlining them. He hasn't confirmed that he will not annex territory. And I think that's quite a big one. Donald Trump put his foot down and said no annexation of the West Bank in response to the many EU countries recognizing the state of Palestine. That means no annexation of Gaza. No Jewish settlements will be built in Gaza. And talks must be established with the Palestinians for eventual statehood. That's something also that has a big question mark, because I mean, remember the last ceasefire in January, it fell apart because Netanyahu refused to send a delegation to continue talks to move to what was then called Phase B of the ceasefire to find a permanent end to the war. And that was a sticking point that he ended up resuming the war over, unilaterally breaking the ceasefire and resuming fighting. So these are all hurdles that we will likely see in the coming weeks.
And Gabby, just explain why that's such a sticking point. So the no annexation of Palestinian territory. So, that there will be no Jewish settlements in Gaza, no annexation of the West Bank. And just explain why that's going to be so controversial for members of Netanyahu's government.
This is what may make the government fall and may see Israel hold elections early. We see members of his government, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, namely. Itamar Ben-Gvir in charge of police, in charge of prisons, national security minister, Bezalel Smotrich in charge of finance, which means he funds and approves settlement building in the West Bank. He's vowed to bury the idea of a Palestinian state. Their mission, their messianic mission that they believe is a God-given right to settle in land given by God, promised to the Jews. And this is the hill that they want to die on.
And Gabby, the question of future Palestinian statehood, do you think that would ever be acceptable to the Israeli electorate?
Yes. The majority of Israelis, I would say a good 50% from public polls and from experts I speak to, believe in a two-state solution. And maybe even more than that, because many people believe in a two-state solution, but they don't see how it can happen right now. And they rather maintain the conflict as is than progress to peace talks at the moment, because there is a lot of mistrust of the Palestinian community. And that goes both ways, of course. The Palestinians also don't trust the Israelis. I actually saw a new poll today, which I thought was quite interesting, showing that 52% of Palestinians hoped for a two-state solution. So that's quite even. That's saying there are moderates on both sides of the Israeli and the Palestinian public who want to see two states side by side. That being said, there's around 25 to 30%, also on both sides, who want one state, who want either a Palestinian state from the river to the sea and the destruction of the state of Israel on the Palestinian side, and on the Israeli side, they want to see a Jewish state from the river to the sea and the expulsion of the Palestinians and the resettlement of, these areas that are promised to Palestine as a future state, the West Bank and Gaza.
Give us a bit of the other details that have now been revealed in terms of how this interim period will actually be run. Who will be in charge of Gaza?
The plan is for an international authority to rebuild and run Gaza after the Israeli military occupation of the territory ends. This will be chaired by US President Donald Trump. The board will be made up of 7 to 10 people, under which will sit a secretariat of up to 25 people who then will oversee this kind of executive body who will run the territory. At least one of those on the board, so one of those 7 to 10 people will be a Palestinian representative, either from the business or the security sector. And the rest is supposed to be leading international figures with executive or financial experience. The board, so the board of 7 to 10 people, is going to be tasked with approving legislation, appointing people, providing strategic direction for rebuilding the territory. What wasn't mentioned is who's going to finance that. Trump did mention the World Bank. That's a possibility, but the finer details clearly haven't been knocked out in this rather broad strokes plan to run the Gaza Strip. The fact that it's like a multinational board and it does risk humiliating the Palestinians in a way. It can be seen as rather a colonialist plan. And let's talk about Tony Blair, who's been raised to run this, this transnational board. We hear that Tony Blair came up with the plan. A US source told the Times earlier this year that Blair was commissioned by Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to come up with some kind of post-war plan. This is according to this US official, because of the former prime minister's connections and dealings with Israeli, Palestinian, and Arab leaders throughout his political history. He is not well liked by the Palestinians. In his history in the Middle East, we have to remember his role in the Iraq War and the support he gave to George W. Bush in invading Iraq over the false accusation that they had nuclear weapons. In his role in the quartet, when he was prime minister, and until 2007, he was heavily involved in the Middle East and seen as a supporter of Israel, siding with Israel over the years. So there is something that almost takes us back to colonial times, where we're actually in a period now of seeing self-determination of states. And this is a slight slide back to the mandate era. I think that is likely to humiliate and anger many Palestinians.
And Gabby, one of the other aspects that comes out in the deal is the creation of a board which looks specifically at the economic opportunities in Gaza. Again, this has President Trump at its head. How will that go down with the Palestinians? On the one hand, I suppose, there's great economic opportunity. On the other hand, he is the man who talked about turning it into a real estate venture. What are they going to think?
The good thing about this plan is that it does not see the forced expulsion of Palestinians. Palestinians who live in the territory will be allowed to stay in the territory. That word says a lot, allowed. And those who choose to leave will be allowed to come back in as well. That's quite different from a plan that was floated earlier this year, which would see Gaza become somewhat of a multinational real estate prize, where America would take over the Gaza Strip and build on prime beach territory and expel the population. That's off the table in this deal, and that is a good thing for Palestinians.
And Gabby, you mentioned earlier the role of Tony Blair in all this. We thought up until that press conference on Monday that he was going to be running any kind of board that was set up to work out the transitional phase of what happens in Gaza. We now know that Donald Trump is taking on that role. He's very proud of it. Just talk us through Tony Blair's involvement. What do we know?
We know that he was tapped by the White House. He was authorized by Donald Trump to build support for this proposal to establish this post-war body to govern Gaza. His role was also accepted from my sources in Israel by Israel. They saw him as a good leader for this. We know that Blair met Trump at the White House at the end of August in a meeting that was organized by Jared Kushner. And Trump then in August, at the end of August, at the end of last month, made clear that he supported this plan, said go and secure Arab leaders and Muslim leaders' support for this plan, including a Saudi leader, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So I think he will have a role. And he has done this kind of thing before. In terms of a peace agreement, then we can look at the Good Friday Agreement. Although he's not officially involved in the negotiation over peace, that's the Qataris' role. He had a role in the Good Friday Agreement to end sectarian violence in Northern Ireland. I think that gave him a taste to solve thorny conflicts like this one. A year later, he rallied together NATO allies for a military intervention in Kosovo. He's also had experience running a place post-conflict. We can look at Sierra Leone. In May 2000, he sent in a British force as a civil war was raging that was destroying the country. So those British troops supported a UN operation that was kind of teetering and wasn't doing very well, and it actually ended up doing really well. So 18 months later, the civil war ended, and officials from Tony Blair's office were actually still in Sierra Leone, in their finance and in their health ministries 10 years later. So it shows really that Blair has helped before, and actually he didn't even abandon ship after either. He made sure and he saw that through, and the place is doing much better. So that he has this kind of background of going in and solving things for all the damage he did in Iraq. There is also this flip side to that. The transitional government's also based on other examples we've seen in the globe, like East Timor and Kosovo during their transitions to statehood, a post-conflict peace-building, state-building process that's kind of characterized by this UN-led transition to independence. The question is, how can a territory achieve independence after occupation? How can a territory like Gaza be independent after being completely destroyed and turned into a moonscape? This is some kind of plan for that, and Tony Blair may be a good person to lead that.
And what do we know about how this International Transitional Authority. What do we know about how it would work, where it would be based? Do we have any of the detail yet?
I did see in the leaks of the plan, so before the actual 20-point plan was officially published by the White House, that it would be based in Al Arish, which is in Sinai, on the border with Gaza. I suppose that could still be an option if Egypt is still involved and they agree to something like that. But again, the finer details are just not there. This is very broad strokes, this plan.
And what has Tony Blair said about this? Has he commented on his role?
So when approached by the Times, he actually said that he had no comment. The spokesperson said that he didn't have a comment. I think he's keeping quite quiet as the details are worked out and as this needs to be accepted.
And Gabby, from where you are, how is this deal going down? Because the Israeli people will have seen the press conference. They will have seen Benjamin Netanyahu's address in Hebrew, which say a slightly modified version of what the paper deal is. What do people there make of it?
The majority of Israelis want to see an end to the war. Let's also talk about the isolation that Israel's facing, that Israelis are facing. Every Israeli I speak to, when I tell them, I'm from London, they're like, oh, what's it like there? I'm scared to go. I'd love to go, but we feel not welcome. There's a real sense of people hate us. The globe hates us. And we're seeing that translated, of course, diplomatically with the recognition of Palestine, which many Israelis feel blindsided them and rewarded Hamas without, giving anything back to the Israelis. Economically, trade agreements, culturally, Israelis aren't welcome on many stages. Concerts have been cancelled. Let's talk about the treasured Eurovision, which Israelis really hold very dear. The idea that they may not be able to participate is very hurtful. Can the Israelis be brought back into the international fold if this war ends? Quite possibly. I think many people want to see that.
And what about amongst Palestinians? Do we have a sense of how they view this potential deal?
The Palestinians I spoke with over the last 2 days say that it's quite a humiliating deal. They feel that their voice hasn't been taken into account. That being said, anything that stops the war, anything that stops their suffering, anything that allows them to return to their homes, to rebuild their lives, is welcome. That is the main thing, I think, for Gazans who have gone through unimaginable suffering for the last 2 years.
And Gabby, it all comes down now to Hamas. Do we have a sense of whether this is a deal they can sign up to?
From the sources I've spoken to, it's my understanding that this all goes down to Izzeddin al-Haddad, who is the leader of Hamas within the Gaza Strip. He's thought to be in Gaza City. He took over, of course, from Mohammed Sinwar, who took over from Yahya Sinwar. Both leaders were assassinated by Israel. It's my understanding from Israeli intelligence sources that Haddad holds the final decision. Him alongside Khalil al-Khaya, who is the chief negotiator for Hamas in Qatar. So you have these two Hamas leaderships in Doha and in Gaza. The ones in Gaza are quite hard to reach, so they traditionally take quite a long time to respond. But it's my understanding that they are more inclined to accept a deal. They're the ones who want to keep Gaza Palestinian. They don't want to see it go under Israeli occupation. They don't want to be the last leaders to see Gaza fall. And they also see the suffering going on, and they need a break. They want a break. The ones in Doha are holding a little bit more firm. And I think that's particularly the case in light of the attempted Israeli assassination on their heads. So there is some tension between these two different leaderships of Hamas. I can't predict what they're going to choose. I will say, so far, they have not ever agreed to put down their arms. Why would they agree to this now? Why would they agree to give up the hostages, which is seen as their last negotiating cards, only to see Gaza go to a foreign force? So their agreement is very much contingent on how desperate they are to end the war. And we may see them hold firm and say this agreement isn't something that we can go for.
And finally, Gabby, you live in Israel, you have a young family. Is this a moment of hope?
Journalists go into their job, or at least I did, and I know many other of my colleagues do, because they want to witness history, and they want to witness change, and they want to see change for the better. They want to see democracy in its process, in its progress. And so there's always hope that better things are around the corner, especially as we've seen so much war and destruction and suffering over the last few years. Yesterday, actually, I spoke with Theodore Meron, who's a judge of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, actually. And he told me that the greatest legal change often comes from the worst atrocities. If this atrocity of the Gaza war, if the atrocities of October the 7th can lead to something better for our children, something better for the future generations, yeah, you have to have hope. It would be amazing to see something good come out of something so terrible. We can only hope.
That was Gabrielle Weiniger, our Israel correspondent, talking to us from Tel Aviv. You can find all the latest on the deal and Hamas's response to it at thetimes.com, and there'll be regular updates across Times Radio. The producer today was Olivia Case. The executive producer was Taryn Siegel, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.